A simple trip to the corner store turned into a life-changing event when an accusation, fueled by prejudice, spiraled out of control. What began as a seemingly routine errand for a young man ended with protests, viral outrage, and the potential collapse of a decades-old business. The store owner believed he was protecting his livelihood. The community believed it was time for justice. In the clash between one man's pride and an entire neighborhood's call for fairness, the stakes couldn't be higher. How did this explosive situation unfold? And could anything good possibly come from it? Before we dive into this gripping story of redemption, reflection, and resilience, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you find yourself drawn into this story of Harold's Grocery and the power of change, don't forget to subscribe. It was a bustling afternoon at Harold's Grocery, a quaint corner store nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The store, managed by Mr. Harold, had become a local staple over the years, known for its old-fashioned charm and affordable essentials. Harold, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, prided himself on running the shop his way, meticulously, cautiously, and with a deep suspicion of anything out of the ordinary. That day, the store was teeming with regulars. Conversations mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and the faint chime of the entrance bell cut through the noise every few minutes as customers came and went. Harold stood behind the counter, his gaze flickering over the aisles. While he wouldn't call himself paranoid, Harold believed in keeping a close watch on everything and everyone. To him, this was not just a precaution. It was a cornerstone of good business. The bell chimed once more, and a young man named Ethan stepped inside. He carried himself with confidence, dressed neatly in a crisp button-up shirt and jeans, with a small backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Ethan nodded politely to the cashier before grabbing a shopping basket near the entrance. Harold's eyes narrowed. This was not a face he recognized, and new customers always made him uneasy. Harold had grown used to the familiar faces of his loyal patrons, people whose habits and preferences he could almost predict. Ethan, on the other hand, was a mystery, a variable Harold didn't like. As Ethan moved through the aisles, pausing occasionally to pick up a box of cereal or inspect a can of soup, Harold's attention zeroed in on him. Ethan pulled out his phone, glancing at his screen and tapping away. Harold stiffened. He muttered under his breath, "What's he up to with that phone?" Every time Ethan glanced at the shelves and back at his screen, Harold's suspicions deepened. Never mind that Ethan's behavior was perfectly ordinary, checking off items from a shopping list as many customers did. To Harold, this was a red flag. Ethan eventually made his way to the refrigerated section and picked up a carton of milk. As he examined the label, Harold decided he had seen enough. Pushing himself up from behind the counter, Harold stepped into the aisle, his footsteps heavy on the tiled floor. "What do you think you're doing?" Harold's voice cut through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Ethan looked up, startled. He blinked at Harold, confusion etched across his face. "I'm just shopping," Ethan replied, holding up his basket to show its contents, clearly unpaid but untouched. Harold's gaze shifted to Ethan's backpack. "And what's in there?" he demanded, pointing accusingly. "You think I didn't notice you sneaking around? Trying to stuff something into your bag, huh?" Ethan froze, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't stolen anything. You can check my bag if you want, but I'm just here to buy groceries." Harold waved off Ethan's words with an impatient hand. "I've seen this before. People like you think they can walk in here, take whatever they want, and walk out without paying. Not in my store." His words hung heavy in the air, the implication clear. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong." By now, other customers had begun to notice the tension. Whispers rippled through the aisles, and a few onlookers stopped to watch. A woman near the dairy section discreetly pulled out her phone and began recording the exchange. Harold, undeterred by the growing audience, stormed back toward the counter. Grabbing the phone, he dialed the police. "There's a shoplifter in my store," he barked into the receiver. "He's refusing to leave." Ethan remained where he was, gripping the handle of his shopping basket tightly. His heart raced, not out of guilt, but out of disbelief and frustration. How had a routine shopping trip turned into this? As Harold barked into the phone, Ethan glanced around the store, meeting the eyes of other shoppers. Some looked away quickly, while others stared back with expressions of pity or silent judgment. The faint wail of sirens in the distance broke through the suffocating silence of the store. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Standing near the entrance, Harold crossed his arms, waiting triumphantly for the police to arrive. His confidence was unshaken, and he was convinced that he was doing the right thing, protecting his store and teaching a lesson to someone he believed had ill intentions. Ethan, however, stood still, his face calm, but his mind racing. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, a police car pulled up in front of the store. Two officers stepped out, one of them adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene through the glass doors. Harold greeted them with an air of authority, quickly launching into his version of events. "I caught him red-handed," Harold said, jabbing a thumb toward Ethan. "He's been acting suspicious, sneaking around like he's trying to pocket merchandise. I've had problems like this before. I know the signs." The taller officer, a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor, raised a hand to silence Harold. "Let's handle this one step at a time," he said. He turned to Ethan, his tone neutral. "Sir, would you mind explaining what happened here?" Ethan met the officer's gaze, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I came here to shop," he said, lifting the basket slightly to show its contents. "I've got a list on my phone and I've been checking it. That's all. He's accusing me of stealing for no reason." The officer nodded slowly, glancing at Ethan's basket and then his calm demeanor. "Do you have any items in your backpack?" he asked, his tone professional but firm. Ethan exhaled deeply and slipped the backpack off his shoulder. "No," he said, unzipping it and holding it open for both officers to see. Inside were a water bottle, a notebook, and a set of keys. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their expressions softening. The officer's relaxed demeanor did little to deter Harold's determination. As one officer examined Ethan's belongings and found nothing out of the ordinary, Harold raised his voice, a sharp edge of frustration lacing his words. "That doesn't prove anything," he barked. "He could have put something back the moment he saw me watching." The officer turned to Harold, his calm professionalism now tinged with firmness. "Sir," he asked pointedly, "do you have any evidence that this man stole something? Did you see him take anything?" Harold faltered, his confidence wavering for the first time. He hadn't actually seen Ethan take anything, but his instincts, the same instincts he had relied on for years, told him that something was amiss. "Well, no," he admitted reluctantly, his voice quieter now, "but I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's up to no good." Before the officer could respond, a voice interrupted from nearby. "Excuse me," the woman who had been recording said, stepping forward with her phone in hand. Her tone was sharp and resolute. "I've been standing here the whole time, and all I've seen is this young man shopping like anyone else. This is ridiculous." Her words carried a weight that silenced the murmurs of the other customers. A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd as several others nodded or voiced their support for Ethan. Harold's face reddened, and for the first time he seemed unsettled. The officer turned to the woman. "Do you have footage of the incident?" She handed over her phone. "I do," she said firmly. "I started recording when he began accusing the man for no reason." As one officer reviewed the video, the room fell silent. Ethan stood motionless, gripping his basket tightly as he waited for the next move. Harold, now visibly nervous, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his earlier bravado waning. After a few moments, the officer reviewing the video exchanged a brief but telling glance with his partner. Turning to Ethan, the taller officer said, "It appears there's no evidence against you. You're free to go." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his face remained tense. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but cold. He turned to leave, but the officer held up a hand. "One more thing," he said, his tone now addressing Harold. "Sir, based on what we've seen and heard, you made these accusations without any substantial proof. That's a serious matter. False accusations can have real consequences." Harold opened his mouth to protest, but the sharp look in the officer's eyes silenced him. The gathered customers, emboldened by the officer's words, began murmuring more loudly. Many were now openly glaring at Harold, their frustration evident. A few customers who had been holding items returned them to the shelves and left the store, shaking their heads as they passed. Harold stood frozen, his authority slipping away as the crowd's disapproval grew. Ethan walked outside, the cool afternoon air hitting his face as the tension in his chest began to ease. He sat on a bench near the store, pulling out his phone to text a friend. His hands trembled slightly as he typed a short message recounting the incident. Anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, but more than that, he felt a heavy sense of disillusionment. This wasn't just about him, he realized. How many others had Harold treated this way? Back inside the store, the fallout was just beginning. Customers who had witnessed the incident continued to whisper among themselves, casting judgmental glances at Harold. One by one, they trickled out, leaving behind half-filled carts and baskets. Sophie, the young cashier who had worked at Harold's grocery for 2 years, stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold with a mix of discomfort and hesitation. She had seen Harold act this way before, but this time, it felt different, bigger, more public and impossible to ignore. Finally, she spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harold," she said hesitantly. Harold turned to her, his expression a mixture of irritation and weariness. "What is it?" he snapped. Sophie took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "I think you really messed up today," she said. Harold's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" he barked, his tone defensive. Sophie continued, her voice shaking slightly but resolute. "Ethan didn't do anything wrong. You embarrassed him in front of everyone, scared off customers, and made the whole situation worse. People aren't going to forget this." Her words hit Harold like a slap. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. Then, dismissing her with a wave of his hand, he muttered, "You don't know what you're talking about. I was protecting my store. If they don't like it, they can shop somewhere else." Sophie shook her head, biting back the response she wanted to give. Instead, she reached under the counter, grabbed her bag, and said quietly, "Well, they are shopping somewhere else, and I think I will too. I quit." Before Harold could respond, Sophie turned and walked out, leaving him standing alone in the increasingly empty store. Outside, Ethan's phone buzzed with notifications. The video of the incident had already started gaining traction on social media. Comments poured in, some from people in the neighborhood who recognized the store and shared their own experiences of being mistreated by Harold. Others came from strangers, outraged by the blatant prejudice on display. As Ethan scrolled through the growing threat, a message popped up from a local activist group. They had seen the video and wanted to help bring more attention to the issue. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to step into the spotlight. But then he thought about Harold's accusatory glare, the unspoken judgment behind his words, and the way the other customers had looked at him. This wasn't just about his experience. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. He typed a quick response. "Let's do it." The next morning, Harold unlocked the door to his store, as he had done every day for the past 20 years. The familiar creak of the door and the hum of the refrigerator units greeted him as usual, but something felt off. The street outside was quieter than usual. For the first time in years, there was no line of regulars waiting for their morning coffee or pastries. Harold glanced around nervously before flipping the sign to open. He convinced himself it was just an off day, perhaps due to the weather or an event elsewhere in town. But as the morning dragged on, it became clear that this was no coincidence. Only a few customers trickled in, and their behavior was markedly different. They moved hesitantly through the aisles, avoiding eye contact with Harold. Some left without buying anything, their wary glances telling him everything he needed to know. By mid-morning, Harold was feeling the weight of the situation. He busied himself behind the counter, pretending not to notice the empty aisles, but the silence was deafening. The absence of chatter, the squeak of shopping carts, and the usual bustling energy of the store gnawed at him. Then the delivery truck arrived. Harold sighed in relief, glad for the distraction. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, but his demeanor was different this time, colder, almost distant. "Here for the weekly delivery?" Harold asked, trying to keep his tone light. The driver hesitated before handing Harold the clipboard. "Guess you've seen the comments online," he said casually, glancing at his phone. Harold stiffened, his stomach twisting. "What comments?" he asked sharply, though he already had an idea of what the driver was referring to. The driver raised an eyebrow. "The video," he replied. "It's everywhere. People are mad. Some are saying they're never shopping here again." Harold's face flushed. He muttered under his breath as he scribbled his signature on the delivery form and waved the driver off. But the man's words lingered, buzzing in Harold's ears like an annoying fly. As soon as the truck pulled away, Harold grabbed his phone and searched for his store's name. What he saw made his stomach drop. Post after post criticized him for his treatment of Ethan, calling him out for his unfair assumptions and behavior. The video of the incident had amassed thousands of views, and the comments were relentless. "Racist and rude owner," one comment read. "I've shopped there for years, but never again," said another. "I had a similar experience there once," someone added. "Always watching certain people like hawks." Harold's hands trembled as he scrolled through the flood of negative reviews. His store's once strong reputation was now in ruins. "This is out of control," he muttered to himself, slamming his phone down on the counter. But no matter how much he tried to dismiss it, the sharp pang of guilt creeping in was impossible to ignore. For years, Harold had prided himself on running his store his way, not caring much about what people thought of him. But now, it wasn't just one angry customer or a small misunderstanding. This was bigger, louder, and impossible to brush aside. By late afternoon, the store was practically deserted. Harold paced behind the counter, the ticking clock on the wall marking the minutes of silence. He couldn't remember the last time his store had been so empty. A couple of young men passed by the storefront, peering inside but not entering. One of them pulled out his phone, snapping a picture of the empty aisles before laughing and walking away. Harold clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. In the quiet moments, his mind wandered back to the incident with Ethan. For the first time, Harold replayed it in his head, not as the proud store owner defending his business, but as an outsider watching himself through the lens of the video. "I feel different now because of the way he spoke, Ethan, and the assumptions he had. Sharper. Uglier." He shook the thought away quickly, refusing to let it take root. As the day came to a close, Harold locked up the store and stepped outside. The street was still eerily quiet, save for the occasional passerby, who glanced at the store with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. For the first time, Harold felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Still, he couldn't bring himself to admit that he might have been wrong. He convinced himself it was just a rough patch, something he could ride out with time. But deep down, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning of his troubles. The following morning, Harold arrived at the store to find a small group of people gathered outside. His heart sank as he realized they weren't there to shop. They held signs with phrases like "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Boycott Harold's Grocery." The protesters stood on the sidewalk, their presence a quiet but undeniable statement. Among them was Ethan, who was talking calmly with a few members of the group. Harold clenched his jaw, gripping his keys tightly as he approached the door. "You can't do this here," Harold snapped, his voice breaking the tense silence. "This is private property. I'll call the police if you don't leave." Ethan didn't flinch. His voice was calm but firm as he replied, "We're on the sidewalk, Mr. Harold. That's public property. We have every right to be here." Several people in the group nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on Harold with quiet defiance. Harold felt a surge of frustration, but knew he couldn't argue with the legality of their presence. Instead, he swung the door open and stormed inside, slamming it behind him. But the protesters didn't budge. Every time Harold glanced through the window, he saw more people stopping to join them, some taking photos and sharing them online. The weight in his chest grew heavier with each passing minute. Inside, the store remained eerily empty. A handful of customers trickled in, but the energy in the room was tense. Several people whispered among themselves, glancing nervously at the protesters outside. A few left without buying anything, shaking their heads as they passed. By noon, Sophie returned, not to work, but to join the protest. She stood beside Ethan, holding a sign that read, "Equal treatment for all." When Harold saw her through the window, he felt a sharp pang of betrayal. How could she, someone he had known for years, stand against him like this? Unable to take it any longer, Harold stepped outside, his anger boiling over. "Sophie," he called out, his voice echoing down the street. "What are you doing out here? I gave you a job when no one else would." Sophie lowered her sign, meeting his gaze calmly. "And I appreciated that," she said. "But that doesn't excuse how you treated Ethan or the way you've acted for years. I stayed quiet too long. I can't do it anymore." Harold's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief as Sophie's calm yet resolute words echoed in his ears. Around her, other protesters murmured their agreement, some lifting their signs higher. The sight of the growing crowd and Sophie standing among them was a blow Harold hadn't expected. "This is my store," he shouted, his voice trembling with frustration. "I've run this place for decades, always doing what's best for my business. I don't need a lecture from you or anyone else." Sophie held her ground, her voice unwavering. "You might think you've been doing what's best, Mr. Harold, but at whose expense? People in this community, your customers, have felt unwelcome here for years because of the way you treat them. This isn't just about Ethan. It's about everyone." Before Harold could respond, Ethan stepped forward, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Harold's escalating frustration. His voice cut through the growing tension. "No one's trying to take your store away, Mr. Harold," he said, his tone measured. "But you need to understand the harm you've caused. You accused me of something I didn't do simply because of how I looked. That's not just bad business, it's wrong." Harold opened his mouth ready to fire back, but the words stuck in his throat. Ethan's statement stung, not because it was harsh, but because it felt uncomfortably true. Harold clenched his fists, his pride refusing to let him back down. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel and stormed back inside, slamming the door behind him. The rest of the day passed in a blur of mounting tension. Harold stayed behind the counter, occasionally peering out the window at the growing crowd of protesters. They remained steadfast, their presence a constant thorn in his side. People passing by stopped to take photos or join in, and a local news crew eventually showed up, their cameras pointed directly at the store. Harold's stomach churned as he watched the reporter interview Ethan and other members of the group. Through the glass, he could see the determined expressions on their faces, the way they spoke with conviction. Harold felt the weight of their words, even though he couldn't hear them. That evening, after the protesters dispersed and the street grew quiet again, Harold locked up the store and headed home. The silence of his dimly lit living room was almost suffocating as he replayed the day's events in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan standing firm, or Sophie's voice as she called him out for years of behavior he had always justified to himself. Harold muttered aloud, "I was just doing what any business owner would do, protecting my property." But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. Deep down, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. For decades, Harold had operated his store with the belief that his instincts were always right, that his methods were simply good business. Now, faced with the backlash of his actions, he wasn't so sure. The next morning brought no relief. When Harold arrived at the store, he was met with a new sight, flyers plastered on nearby lampposts and walls. The bold letters read, "Stand against injustice. Boycott Harold's Grocery." Beneath the text was a link to the now viral video of Harold's confrontation with Ethan, which had amassed tens of thousands of views. Harold ripped one of the flyers down, crumpling it in his hand, but it didn't erase the reality staring him in the face. His reputation, his business, his very livelihood, all of it was crumbling, and for the first time, Harold felt powerless to stop it. The store remained eerily empty throughout the day. A few loyal customers trickled in, but their interactions were terse, and they avoided Harold's gaze. Even those who typically exchanged pleasantries with him seemed distant, their loyalty shaken by the controversy. Harold felt their judgment like a weight on his shoulders. Around midday, his phone buzzed with a call from the building's landlord. Dreading the conversation, Harold reluctantly answered. "Mr. Harold," the landlord began, his tone calm but firm. "I've been hearing about the situation at your store. We need to talk about your lease." Harold's heart sank. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. I'm saying this kind of negative attention isn't good for the property or the other tenants. You need to resolve this quickly, or I'll have to reconsider our agreement." The line went dead, leaving Harold sitting in stunned silence. For years he had believed his store was untouchable, a cornerstone of the community. Now it felt like the entire world was against him, and he didn't know how to fight back. That evening, Harold sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. The video of the incident had now surpassed 100,000 views, and the comments were relentless. People from the neighborhood shared their own stories of feeling unwelcome or judged at Harold's grocery. Each post, each review, was like a punch to the gut. Among the flood of criticism, one post caught Harold's attention. It was from Ethan. Unlike the others, it wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, it was thoughtful, even measured. "This isn't about tearing someone down," Ethan had written. "It's about holding people accountable and making our community better. I hope Mr. Harold learns from this and takes the opportunity to change. That's all we want, fairness and respect for everyone." Harold read the post several times, feeling an odd mix of emotions: anger, guilt, and something else he couldn't quite name. Ethan had every reason to attack him, yet he hadn't. Instead, he was calling for something Harold had never considered: change. The thought made Harold's chest tighten. Change? After all these years? He had always prided himself on being a pillar of the community, someone people could rely on. But now he was forced to confront a harsh question. Had he ever truly been fair to the people he claimed to serve? The next morning, Harold's phone buzzed again, this time with emails from his suppliers. Several of them, citing reputational concerns, were terminating their contracts. Without reliable suppliers, Harold couldn't stock his shelves. Without customers, it wouldn't matter, even if he could. His phone rang again, and Harold stared at the screen. The caller ID showed the name of one of his oldest friends, a fellow store owner. For a moment, Harold considered ignoring it. But as the phone continued to ring, he picked up, dreading yet another difficult conversation. Harold hesitated before answering the call, unsure of what to expect. The voice on the other end belonged to Robert, a longtime acquaintance and fellow business owner who operated a store across town. "Harold," Robert began, his tone measured. "I saw the video. It's all over the place." Harold sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I suppose you're calling to join the chorus, huh? Tell me how I screwed up?" There was a pause before Robert replied. "I'm not calling to rub salt in the wound. I'm calling because I think you need to hear something important." Harold frowned but said nothing, prompting Robert to continue. "You've been running that store the same way for decades, and maybe it worked for a while. But times change, Harold. Communities change. People expect more than just a place to shop. They want to feel welcome and respected. And if you can't see that, you're going to lose everything." Harold clenched his jaw, anger rising in his chest. "You think I don't know that? Look around, Robert. My store's empty. My suppliers are cutting ties, and there's a group of people outside with signs telling everyone I'm the enemy. What am I supposed to do?" Robert's voice softened. "Start by listening. You can't fix this if you don't understand what's broken, and you need to show people you're willing to change, not just say it." The words lingered in Harold's mind long after the call ended. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table staring at the blank notebook in front of him, Robert's advice echoed in his ears. Start by listening. But how? Harold had spent years running his store his way, convinced he knew what was best. Now he was being told to tear it all down and rebuild, not just the store, but himself. He picked up his pen, hesitated, and then wrote 3 simple words at the top of the page. What went wrong? For the first time, Harold allowed himself to sit with the question, letting the weight of his choices settle over him. Memories of past interactions surfaced, moments where he had judged customers unfairly, dismissed complaints, and refused to adapt. The next morning, Harold arrived at the store earlier than usual. The protesters were already there, their signs and chants as steady as ever. Ethan stood among them, his calm presence a stark contrast to Harold's simmering frustration. Harold lingered by the door, watching from a distance. Something about Ethan's quiet determination unsettled him. It wasn't anger that drove the young man, it was conviction. As Harold stepped inside, an idea began to take shape. He couldn't erase the past, but maybe he could start making amends. Later that day, Harold made a call to the community center, a place he had avoided for years, believing it had little to do with his business. The woman who answered recognized his name immediately, her tone wary but professional. "I'd like to contribute to your food drive this weekend," Harold said, his voice steady despite the nerves tightening his chest. "And I'd like to volunteer too." There was a pause on the other end. "That's unexpected, Mr. Harold," the woman replied, "but we won't turn down help. Bring whatever you can. The event starts at 9 a.m. Harold hung up, his resolve firming. This was his chance to show the community he cared, not just through words but through actions. The night before the food drive, Harold stayed late at the store, packing boxes with canned goods, dry food, and other essentials from his inventory. He carefully selected items, wanting to make sure his contribution was meaningful. By the time he finished, the store shelves looked even barer than before. But Harold didn't care. The next morning, Harold arrived at the community center with the trunk of his car packed to the brim. The buzz of activity was unlike anything he'd experienced in years. Volunteers bustling about, unloading donations, and organizing supplies. As Harold approached with his boxes, a few volunteers glanced at him curiously. Whispers rippled through the group, their wary expressions a reminder of the skepticism that surrounded him. Ethan was there, too, sorting donations into neat piles. When he noticed Harold, his eyebrows raised slightly, but his face remained neutral. "Didn't think you'd show up this early," Ethan said, his tone even. "I figured it was the least I could do," Harold replied, setting down a box. "I wanted to help." Ethan studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, grab some gloves. There's plenty of work to go around." Harold spent the next few hours elbow-deep in tasks he had never imagined doing, unpacking donations, stacking boxes, and greeting families who came to pick up food. At first, the interactions were stiff. People avoided his gaze or responded curtly when he tried to make small talk. But as the day went on, something began to shift. A woman approached Harold with her young son in tow, her eyes filled with cautious warmth. "Thank you for this," she said softly, nodding toward the bag of groceries she held. "It makes a big difference." Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm just glad I can help," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. The boy clutched a small toy he had picked from a donation bin, smiling shyly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harold felt a genuine connection to the people around him. By mid-afternoon, Harold noticed Ethan watching him from across the room. There was no judgment in Ethan's gaze this time. It was just a quiet observation. Harold chose not to dwell on it, instead focusing on the work in front of him. As the food drive wound down, Harold found himself standing beside Ethan, stacking the last of the empty boxes. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. "You did good today," Ethan said finally, breaking the quiet. Harold glanced at him surprised. "Thanks," he said, his voice almost uncertain. "I'm just trying to make things right." Ethan shrugged, his tone measured. "It's a start. But like I said before, it's not just about today. People will remember what you did before, but they'll also notice what you do now." Harold nodded, taking the words to heart. "I know, and I'm ready to keep trying." Ethan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good. Keep showing up. That's how you build trust." As the last of the donations were packed away and the volunteers began to leave, Harold lingered for a moment, watching the others. There was a warmth in the room, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Harold realized what he had been missing, not just in his business, but in his life. The day after the food drive, Harold sat at the counter in his empty store, staring at the notebook he had been using to gather his thoughts. The page in front of him was filled with hastily scribbled ideas. Some crossed out, others circled and underlined. His mind kept returning to Ethan's words the day before. "People will remember what you did before, but they'll also notice what you do now." It wasn't just about fixing what had gone wrong, it was about building something better. Harold knew he couldn't undo the damage overnight, but perhaps he could start by making his store a place where the community felt welcome again. By midday, Harold had made a decision. He picked up the phone and called a local printer. "I need some flyers made," he said, "for a community open house this weekend. I want everyone to know they're invited." The printer asked for the details, and Harold described his plan. The event would be simple: refreshments, conversation, and, most importantly, an open floor for anyone in the neighborhood to share their thoughts about how the store could improve. As Harold hung up, he felt a twinge of anxiety. He knew this event wouldn't magically solve everything, but it was a step toward showing the community he was serious about change. That evening, Harold stepped outside to tape one of the flyers to the store window. As he pressed it into place, he noticed a few passersby stopping to read it. Their reactions were mixed. Some were curious, and others were skeptical. But none were openly hostile, and that small shift gave Harold a flicker of hope. The days leading up to the open house were a whirlwind of preparation. Harold scrubbed the floors, restocked shelves with whatever supplies he could afford, and set up tables with refreshments. Each task felt like a small but meaningful step toward rebuilding trust with the people he had alienated. Finally, the day of the event arrived. Harold stood near the entrance, nervously adjusting a folding table covered with cookies, coffee, and sandwiches. A sign beside it read, "Welcome to our community open house. Share your thoughts." As the clock struck 10 a.m., Harold glanced at the door, his heart sinking as he realized no one had arrived yet. For a brief moment, he imagined the event as a total failure, an empty store. His efforts were dismissed as too little and too late. But then the bell over the door jingled, and Harold looked up to see Ethan walking in. Ethan's expression was guarded, but there was no hostility in his gaze. He nodded toward the refreshments and said, "Looks good? You're really going all in on this, huh?" Harold managed a nervous chuckle. "Trying my best. Thanks for coming." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began walking the aisles, taking in the familiar shelves and displays that now seemed different in the quiet atmosphere of the open house. As Harold watched, a few more people trickled in. An older woman, a man with his teenage son, and eventually, Sophie. Each one entered hesitantly, glancing around as if unsure of what to expect. Harold greeted them with a mixture of nervousness and gratitude, guiding them toward the refreshments or inviting them to sit in the chairs he had arranged near the back of the store. The atmosphere was tense at first, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Harold stood behind the counter, unsure of how to break the ice. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. "Well, Mr. Harold," he said, gesturing toward the small group that had gathered. "This is your chance. Say what you need to say." Harold swallowed hard, stepping out from behind the counter. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in front of him. "Bookmark. First of all," he began, his voice shaky but sincere, "thank you all for being here. I know it's not easy to walk into a place where you felt unwelcome, and I'm sorry for the part I played in making that happen." He paused, scanning the room for reactions. Some people nodded slightly, while others remained stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. "I've been running this store the same way for a long time," Harold continued. "And I didn't realize how much harm I was causing. I made assumptions about people, about you, and I was wrong. I know an apology isn't enough, but I'm here today because I want to listen. I want to know how I can do better." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sophie, standing near the back, broke the silence. "It's not just about saying sorry, Mr. Harold," she said. "You need to treat everyone with respect, not just the people you feel comfortable with." "That's right," the older woman chimed in. "I've been shopping here for years, and I've seen how you look at people, especially people that has to change." Harold nodded, taking their words to heart. "You're right," he said, "and I'm committed to doing better. I want to work with the community, not against it." As the conversation continued, more voices joined in. Some offered criticism, recounting moments when they had felt unwelcome or judged in the store. Others shared ideas for improvement, suggesting ways Harold could make the store a more inclusive and welcoming space. Slowly, the tension began to ease. People started to open up, talking not just about what needed to change, but about what the store meant to them and how it could become a better part of the neighborhood. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the store had shifted. While not everyone was ready to forgive Harold, there was a sense of cautious optimism, a belief that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. As the last of the attendees began to leave, Ethan approached Harold, a small smile tugging at his lips. You did good today, Ethan said, his tone almost approving. But like I said before, this is just the beginning. Harold nodded, feeling the weight of Ethan's words. I know, he replied, and I'm ready to keep going. Ethan studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. Harold hesitated for just a second before shaking it firmly. For the first time in weeks, Harold felt a sense of purpose, a belief that he was moving in the right direction, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. In the days following the open house, Harold felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The turnout had been modest, and the feedback was sharp, but it had left him with a clear understanding. Rebuilding trust wasn't going to happen overnight. The suggestions from the open house echoed in his mind as he spent hours cleaning the store and organizing shelves. One idea stood out more than the rest, turning the store into a hub for the community, a place where people felt welcome and supported. That morning, Harold sat at the counter with his notebook, flipping through pages of scribbled notes. His eyes landed on a phrase he had circled multiple times: Community Day. The idea was simple but promising. A day where the store would host activities for the neighborhood, free meals, a forum for sharing ideas, and even small giveaways to families in need. It wasn't just about attracting customers. It was about showing that Harold's Grocery was more than just a business. With a deep breath, Harold picked up his phone and called the local community center. I'm planning an event, he explained, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling in his stomach. I'd like to partner with you and invite the neighborhood. The woman on the other end sounded surprised but receptive. That's a good idea, Mr. Harold, she said. But you'll need to prepare. People will have high expectations after everything that's happened. Harold nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I understand. I'll do my best. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Harold designed flyers announcing the community day and spent evenings hanging them on lampposts, bulletin boards, and storefront windows throughout the neighborhood. He restocked the shelves with fresh produce and essentials, using every spare dollar he could scrape together. As the day approached, Harold felt a mix of anticipation and fear. What if no one showed up? What if people came only to criticize him further? The morning of the event arrived, and Harold stood outside the store, surveying the setup. Long tables draped in colorful tablecloths lined the sidewalk, laden with trays of sandwiches, fruit, and baked goods. A small chalkboard sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Community Day, a fresh start." Inside, Harold had set up a free pantry corner with basic groceries for families in need. He'd even arranged for a few local musicians to perform, hoping to create a festive atmosphere. At 10 a.m., Harold stood near the entrance, nervously adjusting his tie. The first few minutes passed in silence, and his heart sank. Then, the bell above the door jingled, and a young mother stepped inside with her 2 children. "Welcome," Harold said, his voice almost cracking with relief. "Thanks," the woman replied, smiling politely as she guided her kids toward the free pantry. Slowly but surely, more people arrived. An elderly couple strolled in, followed by a group of teenagers from the community center. Harold recognized some familiar faces from the open house, including Sophie and Ethan. Ethan hung back at first, observing the scene with a cautious expression. He watched as Harold greeted every guest personally, his demeanor warm and attentive. The sight of Harold helping an elderly man carry a bag of groceries seemed to catch Ethan off guard. "Looks like he's trying," one of the volunteers murmured to Ethan. Ethan nodded, but didn't reply. His eyes stayed fixed on Harold, watching for any sign of insincerity. By noon, the store and the sidewalk outside were bustling with activity. Children played games on the sidewalk while their parents mingled with neighbors. Harold moved through the crowd, offering food, chatting with guests, and thanking people for coming. At one point, Ethan approached Harold, who was busy handing out sandwiches to a group of teenagers. "You really went all out," Ethan said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Harold turned, surprised but pleased to see him. "I wanted to make it special," he replied. "Thanks for coming." Ethan folded his arms, studying Harold for a moment. "This is a good start," he said finally. "But like I told you before, it's not just about one event. It's about consistency. People are watching, and they're not going to forgive overnight." Harold nodded, taking Ethan's words seriously. "I know," he said, "and I'm ready to show them I mean it." Ethan tilted his head, considering Harold's response. If you're serious about change, there's something else you could do, he said. What's that? Harold asked. Use your store to give back, Ethan replied. Host a food drive, sponsor local programs, or support families who are struggling. You've been a part of this community for years, but it's time to start giving something back. Harold felt a pang of guilt but nodded. You're right. I haven't done enough, but I want to change that. If you have ideas, I'm open to them. Ethan's expression softened slightly. There's a school supply drive happening next month. You could partner with the community center to host it here. It's a good way to show people you're serious about making a difference. Harold smiled, a flicker of hope stirring in his chest. I'll do it. Thank you for trusting me enough to suggest it. Don't thank me yet, Ethan replied with a faint smile. Just make sure you follow through. As the afternoon wore on, the energy of the event shifted. Conversations flowed more freely, and the initial tension seemed to dissolve. Harold noticed Sophie chatting with a group of attendees, her smile genuine for the first time in weeks. By the time the last guests began to leave, Harold felt a profound sense of gratitude. He stood by the door, waving goodbye to families and neighbors who had come to support the event. For the first time in months, the store felt alive, not just as a business, but as a vital part of the community. As Ethan left with a group of volunteers, he turned back to Harold and said, You're on the right path. Just remember, it's a long road. Harold nodded, his resolve firm. I'll keep walking it. The success of Community Day left Harold feeling hopeful, but aware of the road ahead. Ethan's words, it's a long road, echoed in his mind as he walked through the store the following morning. The aisles, still sparsely stocked, reminded him of the damage that hadn't yet been repaired. Determined to keep the momentum going, Harold started making calls. His first stop was the community center, where he offered to host the upcoming school supply drive that Ethan had mentioned. That's a great idea, Mr. Harold, the center's coordinator said. We've been looking for a larger space, and your store could be perfect. Are you sure you're ready for this kind of commitment? Harold didn't hesitate. I'm ready. Just let me know what you need. Over the next few weeks, Harold worked tirelessly to prepare. He cleared out space in the store to make room for donation bins and set up a section near the entrance where people could drop off supplies. He also reached out to local businesses asking for contributions and support. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, advertising the event. Harold personally delivered them to schools, libraries, and even door-to-door, determined to spread the word. His interactions with neighbors were cautious at first. Many still regarded him with skepticism, but as they saw his genuine effort, some began to soften. One afternoon, as Harold was taping a flyer to the community bulletin board, a woman approached him with her young daughter in tow. Are you really hosting this? She asked, her tone laced with doubt. Harold turned to her, nodding. I am. We're collecting supplies for kids who need them, and anyone can contribute. The woman hesitated before replying. I'll think about donating, she said, then paused. It's good to see you trying to make things right. Her words stuck with Harold as he returned to the store. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step in the right direction. As the school supply drive approached, donations began to pour in. Boxes of pencils, notebooks, backpacks, and crayons filled the designated area of the store. Volunteers from the community center stopped by daily to help organize, and Harold worked alongside them, doing everything from stacking supplies to greeting donors. Ethan visited frequently, checking in on the progress. His presence kept Harold grounded, a reminder that trust had to be earned through consistent action. You're doing good work, Ethan said one evening as they stacked boxes of supplies. But remember, this is just the beginning. People are watching, and they'll be quick to notice if you slip back into old habits. Harold nodded, his expression serious. I understand. I'm not doing this for show. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Ethan studied Harold for a moment before giving a small nod. Good. Just keep showing up. The day of the school supply drive arrived with a flurry of activity. Volunteers arrived early to set up tables and sort the donations into neat piles. Families began lining up outside the store well before the event officially started, many of them bringing their children to pick out supplies for the new school year. Harold stood at the entrance, greeting each family with a smile and directing them to the donation tables. At first, the interactions were polite but distant, and many parents were still wary of his intentions. But as the morning wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. A young boy approached one of the tables, his eyes lighting up as he spotted a backpack decorated with his favorite cartoon character. Harold watched as the boy's mother helped him try it on, her smile warm and genuine. "Thank you," she said to Harold as they passed. "This means a lot to us." Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm just glad we could help," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. Throughout the day, similar moments played out. Children clutched their new supplies with excitement, parents expressed gratitude, and volunteers worked tirelessly to keep the event running smoothly. Ethan stayed busy, moving between tables and chatting with families, but he kept an eye on Harold. He noted how Harold interacted with the attendees, offering assistance, making small talk, and even kneeling down to help a little girl tie her shoe. As the event wound down, Ethan approached Harold near the donation bins. "You've done a lot of good here today," Ethan said, his tone neutral but sincere. Harold wiped his hands on a rag, glancing around at the remaining supplies. "It's not just about today," he replied. "I want this to be the start of something bigger. I've been thinking about other ways to give back, partnering with local organizations, hosting more events like this." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious." Harold smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it feels right. I've spent so much time running this store my way, thinking I knew what was best. But now I realize it's about more than just me. It's about the community." Ethan leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "You're starting to get it," he said. "But remember, big changes take time. Don't rush it." Harold nodded. "I'm not expecting overnight success. I just want to keep moving forward." As the last of the families trickled out and the volunteers began packing up, Harold felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The store, once a symbol of division and mistrust, had become a place where people felt supported and connected. That evening, as Harold locked up the store, he stood outside for a moment, watching the quiet street. For the first time in years, he felt like his store had become more than just a business. It was part of something bigger, a community built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges, skeptics, and moments of doubt. But for now, Harold allowed himself a small moment of pride. As he turned to head home, Harold's phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Good job today. Keep it up." Harold smiled, tucking the phone into his pocket. "I will," he thought, his resolve stronger than ever. Weeks after the school supply drive, Harold's grocery had become almost unrecognizable, not in its appearance, but in its atmosphere. The once tense aisles were now alive with conversation and laughter. Customers who had stopped coming after the incident with Ethan began to return cautiously at first, then with more confidence as they noticed the genuine changes Harold had made. Near the store entrance, Harold had installed a community board where neighbors could post announcements, job opportunities, or upcoming events. The board quickly filled with colorful flyers advertising everything from babysitting services to local art shows. One afternoon, Harold noticed a young mother pinning a flyer on the board. She turned and gave him a small smile. "Thank you for putting this up," she said. "It's nice to have a place where the community can connect." "Bookmark, go back," Harold nodded, feeling a flicker of pride. "That's what it's here for. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see." The mother hesitated for a moment, then added, "It's good to see the store changing. I wasn't sure I'd ever come back here after what happened, but it feels different now." Her words stayed with Harold throughout the day. Slowly but surely, he felt the weight of his past mistakes beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One of the biggest changes Harold had implemented was a monthly community day, inspired by the success of the first event. Each month, the store hosted activities like cooking classes, neighborhood forums, and even book drives. Harold worked closely with Ethan and the community center to ensure these events were meaningful and well-organized. The next community day was a family night, complete with free meals and games for children. Harold stood near the buffet table, watching as families filled their plates and mingled. Sophie, who had returned as a volunteer, was helping distribute desserts, her smile brighter than Harold had seen in years. "Looks like things are going well," Ethan said, approaching Harold with a cup of coffee in hand. Harold chuckled, glancing around at the lively scene. "Better than I ever expected," he admitted. "I was worried people wouldn't give me a second chance." Ethan shrugged. "It's not just about second chances. It's about proving you're serious, and you've been doing that." Harold looked at Ethan, his expression thoughtful. "You've been a big part of that, you know. If you hadn't stood up to me, I don't think I'd have realized how much I needed to change." Ethan smiled faintly. "Well, I wasn't just standing up for myself. This community deserves better, and it's good to see you stepping up." As the night went on, Harold felt a growing sense of connection to the people around him. Parents thanked him for organizing the event, children laughed as they played games, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in years found common ground over shared meals. By the time the event ended, Harold was exhausted but deeply satisfied. Ethan stayed behind to help clean up, and as they stacked chairs and folded tables, Harold turned to him with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "What do you think is next for me, Ethan?" Harold asked, his tone serious. Ethan tilted his head, considering the question. "You've done a lot to rebuild trust here, but this can't just be about the store. If you want to make a real difference, you need to think bigger." Harold nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time to look at ways I can support other local businesses or even start a program to help families in need." "That's ambitious," Ethan replied, his tone impressed. "But it's a good idea. Just remember, big changes take time. Don't rush it." "I won't," Harold said, "but I've realized something over the past few months. This store isn't just mine, it belongs to the community. And if I'm not giving back, then I'm not doing my job." Ethan smiled, his respect for Harold growing. "You're starting to get it." The following morning, Harold arrived at the store early, as he always did. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the aisles. Customers began trickling in, greeting Harold with smiles and waves as they picked up their groceries. Near the back of the store, Harold had created a kids' corner stocked with free books and small toys. That morning, a group of children gathered around, giggling as they flipped through colorful picture books. Harold knelt down to hand one little girl a book she couldn't reach, her wide grin reminding him of the joy he had been missing. Ethan arrived later that afternoon, observing the bustling store with a mix of curiosity and pride. He approached Harold, who was helping a customer locate an item on a high shelf. "You've been busy," Ethan said, nodding toward the lively scene. Harold wiped his hands on his apron and smiled. "Better than staring at empty aisles." Ethan crossed his arms, leaning casually against the counter. "People are starting to trust you again. That's not easy to earn." "I know," Harold replied, his tone serious, "and I don't take it for granted. But I'm not stopping here. I've been thinking about other ways to give back, maybe sponsoring scholarships or organizing community events beyond the store." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's a big leap from where you were a few months ago." Harold chuckled. "If I've learned anything, it's that big changes start with small steps, and I want to keep moving forward." The two men shared a rare moment of camaraderie, the tension that had once defined their relationship replaced by mutual respect. As the day wound down, Harold took a moment to step outside and watch the street. The glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, where a few families lingered, chatting and laughing. For the first time in years, Harold felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not just running a store, but being part of something bigger. Months had passed since the day Harold first realized his store was on the brink of collapse. Not because of financial troubles, but because of the damage his actions had caused to the community's trust. Now, as the winter chill settled over the neighborhood, Harold stood outside his store, watching families gather for a special holiday event he had spent weeks preparing. String lights framed the windows of Harold's grocery, casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. Tables were set up outside, piled high with cups of hot cocoa, trays of cookies, and blankets to give away to anyone in need. Laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the uneasy silence that had once haunted the store. Ethan stood near the tables, chatting with a group of teenagers from the community center. Sophie, who had become one of Harold's most vocal supporters, moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and organizing the evening's activities. Harold stepped back inside for a moment, leaning against the counter as he took in the lively scene. The store had transformed into something he had never imagined. No longer just a place of business, but a hub where neighbors could come together, share stories, and support one another. It hadn't been easy. There were still moments when Harold struggled with the weight of his past decisions. Some customers remained skeptical, hesitant to accept that the man who had once been so quick to judge could truly change. But Harold had come to understand that change wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about proving, day by day, that he was committed to doing better. A familiar voice pulled Harold from his thoughts. "You've outdone yourself this time," Ethan said, walking into the store with a grin. Harold smiled, brushing off his apron. "Well, I figured we could all use a little holiday cheer. Besides, I've got a lot to make up for." Ethan tilted his head thoughtfully. "You've come a long way, Harold. When I first walked in here months ago, I never thought I'd see a store like this. You've proven me wrong." Harold laughed softly, the lines on his face creasing with a mix of humor and humility. "I proved myself wrong, too. I thought I had everything figured out, but it turns out I had a lot to learn." Ethan nodded. "That's the thing about change. It doesn't end. You keep growing, keep learning." Harold looked out the window, watching the crowd outside. Families huddled together, children laughing as they clutched steaming cups of cocoa, and neighbors exchanging warm holiday wishes. "I'm starting to see that," Harold said quietly. The evening's main event was a community dinner hosted in the store's back room, which Harold had cleared out and decorated with festive lights and tablecloths. As the guests filed in, Harold greeted each one with a genuine smile. Sophie took charge of serving the food, while Harold moved from table to table, striking up conversations and listening to the stories people shared. He learned about their struggles, their hopes, and the ways the store had become a small but important part of their lives. One conversation stood out in particular. An elderly man named Walter, who had been a regular customer for decades, approached Harold with a plate of food in hand. "You know, Harold," Walter began, his voice warm but firm, "I didn't think you had it in you to change. But seeing all this reminds me of what this neighborhood used to feel like. You've brought something back that we didn't even realize we'd lost." Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you, Walter. That means a lot coming from you." Walter chuckled. "Don't let it go to your head. You've still got work to do." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Harold replied with a grin. As the night went on, Harold found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. From the moment he accused Ethan of theft, to the protests outside his store, to the decision to host the open house and embrace change, every step had been a lesson in humility and growth. By the time the event began to wind down, the store was filled with a sense of warmth and camaraderie. Ethan approached Harold one last time, holding a cup of cocoa and a smile that hinted at genuine respect. "You've built something special here," Ethan said. "It's not just a store anymore. It's a part of the neighborhood." Harold nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room. "That's all I ever wanted. I just didn't realize how far off track I'd gotten." Ethan raised his cup in a mock toast. "Well, here's to keeping it that way, and to prove that change is possible." Harold clinked his coffee cup against Ethan's with a chuckle. "I'll drink to that." As the last guests trickled out and the volunteers began cleaning up, Harold stood outside the store, gazing at the string lights that illuminated the sidewalk. The laughter and conversation of the evening still lingered in the air, a reminder of how far he had come. For the first time in years, Harold felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just as a business owner, but as a member of a community that had taught him the true meaning of connection and accountability. As Ethan left with the remaining volunteers, he turned back to Harold and said, "You're on the right path. Just remember, it's a journey, not a destination." Harold nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm not stopping anytime soon." With that, Harold stepped back inside, the glow of the holiday lights reflecting off the windows. The store was quiet now, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive with possibility, a testament to the power of humility, resilience, and the courage to change. Harold knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more to give, and more ways to grow. But as he turned off the lights and locked the door, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Harold's journey is a testament to the power of self-reflection, accountability, and change. What began as a seemingly ordinary confrontation in a grocery store spiraled into an eye-opening experience that transformed not only Harold's business, but also his role within the community. This story serves as a reminder that change is not about erasing mistakes. It's about owning them and proving, through consistent actions, that growth is possible. At its core, this story is about more than just Harold's redemption. It's about the importance of community, the strength that comes from standing up for what's right, and the courage it takes to break old patterns and build something better. Ethan's calm resolve, Sophie's moral clarity, and the community's willingness to demand change played a crucial role in reshaping Harold's path. Together, they show us that transformation is not a solitary act. It's a shared effort rooted in understanding and compassion. For viewers, the takeaway is clear. Whether we're in Harold's shoes, Ethan's, or standing on the sidelines, we all have the power to shape the communities we're part of. By listening, learning, and taking action, we can create spaces that are welcoming, respectful, and supportive of everyone. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't hesitate to share your own experiences. What lessons have you learned about community, forgiveness, or change? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation about what it means to grow, to listen, and to create a better world together.